The Honourable Damon O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this is another classic National Party conscience-easing piece of legislation, Mr Speaker. It says here the objective of the bill is to reduce offending against wildlife by improving the powers available to effectively detect and investigate offences and apprehend offenders. We assume that that is to protect the endangered species and the species mentioned in the legislation. So the government is setting out, we hope, with the right objective to protect them for good reasons, as has been mentioned in many of the speeches, Mr Speaker, but there are a whole lot of gaps in this, I have to say. It will allow full-time rangers to, in fact, implement the legislation if it proceeds as put to the House. The question is, with the increasing number of volunteers that the department relies on, where does it leave them? Because the facts are that the national government has not funded the Department of Conservation to carry out its core duties, whether it be keeping tracks open or looking after species. Mr Speaker, I'd like the Minister, and I hope the Select Committee will be able to do that. And so it does, as we often see in legislation from the National Party, be it on customs or biosecurity or police, it increases the penalties. It increases the penalties to prevent harm, because they think that sorts out their conscience and they're in fact doing the right thing. The reality is they have squeezed funding from the Department of Conservation and pretty much every other government department to the point where they can't carry out their basic duties, and this legislation will do nothing to protect the species pointed out here because there's not enough basic funding in the department to do its core duty, Mr Speaker. So we'll no doubt see this pass through. There are a few questions I'd like to ask. When we have a department where only 27% of the DOC staff have confidence in their senior leadership, Mr Speaker. No, that's what it is. The Minister shakes her head. Well, I've talked to a large number of Department of Conservation staff and others. I think that's overestimating it. I think that's overestimating it. It's probably taken a couple of months ago, not now. Mr Speaker, they're in trouble. Not because the penalties for harming wildlife are not high enough, but because there's not enough core resource in the department's budget, Mr Speaker. If we're to have penalties for action against wildlife, can't we have penalties against inaction? Which is what I'd charge the government with, because the same outcome is going to occur. If someone was to abuse or pollute a waterway or do whatever, there'll be a negative impact on the inanga or any of the other native species. But if the government doesn't spend the money to administer its core duties, the same outcome occurs. So why don't we boost the penalties in that area? In fact, I'd suggest at the next election, people should vote the government out. That might be a very good way of delivering the right penalty on conservation issues to the national government, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I read through here, and it is quite detailed on what should occur. One of the things that interests me, Mr Speaker, for the West Coast, the bill also provides a limited power of arrest that will enable an enforcement officer to temporarily arrest a suspected offender until the officer can deliver the suspect into police custody. Well, I can tell you, on the West Coast, they might also have to provide a power, Mr Speaker, to feed and accommodate that person, because it's probably going to take you a hell of a long time to get a policeman there, given the national government's underfunding of police, so that we won't have anyone in Karamea. Kaharangi National Park, a huge national park, Mr Speaker, excuse me, where some of these things could occur, and there will be people out there. So if an offender's caught and there's no policeman at Karamea and they have to get one from Greymouth, does that mean the person will have to feed and accommodate the suspected or the person who has been apprehended and suspected of that activity? Mr Speaker, there's a whole lot of things in here that do make me chuckle, because the government's attempt to ease its conscience by increasing the penalties on action against wildlife should be met by the same penalties on inaction by the national government and protected native flora and fauna right across the conservation estate.
I call